Thank you all so much for joining this joint event, which is being held by Scottish Lands and Estates and Woodland Trust on rhododendron and approaches to a growing problem. It's really great to see so many of you join us for this event this morning. So my name is Karen Ramu, and I'm Policy Advisor at Scottish Lands and Estates, where I lead on forestry, conservation and wildlife management, and I'll be chairing this morning's session. So as many of you already know, Scotland's rainforest is a globally important habitat, but rhododendron invasion is threatening this key habitat. And this event focuses on the key findings from the recently published Rhododendron in the Rainforest report, and we will hear about a successful eradication case study in the rainforest zone. I'm pleased to say that we're joined by 5 panel members. In the original agenda that we sent out to you, it was 4, but we've since had a late addition to the agenda, which is fantastic. So Irina Russell, Public Affairs Manager for Woodland Trust Scotland, will kick us off. We'll then hear from Gordon Gray-Stevens, Director at Native Woodlands, and the co-author of the Rhododendron in the Rainforest report. Stuart Fotheringham from Achnacoan Estate, hopefully I've said that properly, case study on the eradication work that they've been doing there. We'll then hear from Lindsay Bissett from Scottish Forestry, who's the grant scheme manager. And very finally, we'll hear from Gareth Parkinson, a ranger for National Trust for Scotland, whose current role is focused on tackling invasive non-native species. So once we've heard from all our panel members, we'll then open the floor for a Q&A round, and we'll close the session promptly at 11:30. Just before we get started, just the usual housekeeping rules on Zoom. If you could please make sure you're all muted. It's entirely up to you if you'd like your cameras on or off. It'd be nice to see your faces. And please, I appreciate we've got quite a packed agenda. So if you've got questions that you want to ask as the speakers go along, if you just pop them on the chat box at the bottom, we'll take them at the very end as part of the Q&A discussion. Without further ado, I will hand over to Irina Russell, who will give an introduction to the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest and the Saving Scotland's Rainforest project. So over to you, Irina.
Thank you, Karen. Can you see my screen and hear me all fine?
All fine, thank you.
Perfect. I'll omit this last person here. Right, so as Karen said, I work for Woodland Trust Scotland as Public Affairs Manager. So I work in policy and advocacy really, but today I'm representing the Woodland Trust as a member of the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest. What I'll do is give you an overview of the Rainforest project, and you'll see I'm using all the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest branding because that's what I'm kind of representing today. So I'll kind of put this all for the whole webinar. We'll go into from a broader context to the narrow one. So just this is an overview of the whole of the rainforest zone and the threats and opportunities to it, and then we'll go into the rhododendron part with the other speakers. Just to put it into the wider picture globally, this is where we have temperate rainforests, where it's all marked with blue. And these are areas where there's high annual rainfall, cool summers, clean air. So just the perfect conditions for this kind of habitat. But Scotland, of course, has some of the best of this habitat in the world. But overall, there are less than 1% of the world's surface has the climatic conditions that support this habitat. And we are known as having the best of this habitat in all of Europe. For Scotland, this is where this rare habitat is found. So along the western edge of Scotland and north of Scotland, there are about 30,000 hectares of rainforest left. So it's highly fragmented, and we class any semi-natural woodland within this climatic zone as rainforest site. The threats faced by this habitat are all kind of large scale threats that need to be tackled at landscape scale, including rhododendron ponticum overgrazing that prevents the woodlands from regenerating. So these are the key threats: overgrazing part and the rhododendron ponticum, but also other threats such as some of these sites being overplanted with commercial conifers. There's climate change, there's tree disease, pollution. So all these threats need to be dealt with at landscape scale. Otherwise, we risk not tackling them in a way that fully restores this habitat. So what's so special about Scotland's rainforest? It's really what we would call lichens and bryophytes, or lower plants, that make it very special. And these give the rainforest a very magical feel. And when you walk into a rainforest site, everything is carpeted with mosses and with lichens. And it's just the sheer quantity and diversity of these species makes the rainforest so special. And Scotland's rainforest has some of the best of these lichens and bryophytes in all of Europe. And some of these species are so rare, with 2 of them only found in Scotland. So we really should protect this habitat because it is really unique. It's also known as a nature-based solution to the twin climate and nature crisis. These woods will lock up carbon permanently. They also help provide ecosystem services like flood prevention and preventing soil erosion. But most importantly, perhaps, is how important the rainforest is to the people that live and work in it. The rainforest zone is really a sparsely populated area. So it's important that whatever we do here, or any action that we take, will kind of be very alive to the local context here. So we are, it's a habitat that will attract tourism and visitors, and it can provide jobs, but also the restoration and the management of the rainforest, as seen in these pictures here, where we're managing rhododendron ponticum. It can offer jobs. It can be part of Scotland's green recovery, and they're very important for the rainforest sites. Are very important for communities, for education as well, and also important for people who use this for walking and running and just live in the area. Now, because we can't save the rainforest alone, because everything needs to be tackled at landscape scale, this is where the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest came in. It's a voluntary partnership. There are now 24 organizations. It was set up by Woodland Trust and Plant Life, and Scottish Land and Estates are also a member, and RSPB I've seen who are here, Scottish Wildlife Trust, National Trust for Scotland, are all members and are all dedicated to ensuring the rainforest will have a future and it will thrive and expand. We also have statutory agencies part of the alliance, such as Forestry Land Scotland and Scottish Forestry as well. This report you can download. It's a report on the state of Scotland's rainforest. It just provides the evidence base for the threats to the rainforest, the case for saving this habitat, and it was launched in 2019. Then in 2021, we produced, or the Woodland Trust produced, a report on rhododendron in the rainforest, and recommending ways to tackle rhododendron using new approaches. We know we need to get rid of this or eradicate rhododendron and stop the invasion of this plant, but we need to do it in new and different ways at catchment scale. So Gordon will tell you more about that. I'll now pass over to Karen. I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharina. That was really useful in terms of setting the background for the next speaker, which is Gordon Gray-Stevens, who is Director at Native Woodlands Group. And Gordon's going to give a presentation of the Rhododendron in the Rainforest report and an introduction to the rhododendron eradication at Glen Creran. Hopefully I've said that right, but over to you, Gordon. Thank you. You can see slides, but we can't hear you, Gordon.
Sorry, I'd lost my unmute button. Good morning. Hopefully you can now see me, hear me, and also see my slides.
Perfect.
So, good. Thank you, Karen, for that confirmation. So I'm Gordon Gray Stevens. I work for the Native Woods Cooperative. And today I'm going to talk about 3 different subjects. So it's a bit of a blended talk today. I'm going to talk about the rhododendron report that Irina introduced and describe some of the key messages within that report for land managers. There's a web link there to that report, which is available online. I'm going to talk about the rainforest restoration proposal that I've been working on along with some members of the Rainforest Alliance. And I'm going to touch on the Glen Creeran experience as well. So first of all, an introduction to rhododendron in the rainforest. A brief history. So it's a European plant that's hybridized actually with a North American plant. And these plants hybridized once they were introduced into Britain. In the 19th, early 20th century, it was widely planted in woodland gardens and also in the wider countryside as game cover. And it is now expanding rapidly. I also need to be clear that we're talking particularly about Rhododendron ponticum, or invasive rhododendron. Lots of people have other specimen rhododendron in their gardens and around their policies, and those rhododendrons don't pose a threat. It is simply the invasive rhododendron, Rhododendron ponticum, that we are talking about today. What are the impacts of the rhododendron on the rainforest? Primarily, it's a light thief. It outcompetes other vegetation by cutting off the light availability. If you look underneath a rhododendron thicket, there is no ground vegetation on the whole. And in the course of time, that rhododendron will outcompete everything else and will be left in a couple of 100 years' time with rhododendron thickets and not very much else in our rainforest. This simplifies and degrades our environment. And in the end of the day, if we allow this to happen, we will lose the biodiversity, the unique biodiversity, which is associated with Scotland's rainforest. As a land manager, rhododendron has other impacts, of course. There are economic costs associated with rhododendron. In this slide here, we see an area which has been cleared of conifer and where the landowner is trying to regenerate native woodland. But you can see that a large component of that native woodland as it stands at the moment will be invasive rhododendron as it spreads through and gets a grip before the native woodland can do so. So there are opportunity costs with rhododendron on your ground. There are also removal costs. Rhododendron is also toxic, so grazing animals, particularly animals that are not hefted ground where there is rhododendron, can be poisoned by that rhododendron. Hefted animals will not eat the rhododendron, but new imports can do so. And it's also increasingly recognized that rhododendron flowers can give toxicity to honey as well and reduce the effectiveness of bees. Finally, it's a disease vector. So over the last 15 years, we've become used to the idea of Phytophthora ramorum invading our larch stands on the west coast of Scotland and elsewhere. And rhododendron is an important vector for this disease. I'll touch now on the scale of the problem. The Alliance's estimate is there are 12,000 hectares of core sites which are affected by rhododendron and 17,000 hectares of other important woodland sites within the rainforest zone. Beyond that, we have 24,000 hectares in a 150-meter buffer zone. This has not been surveyed, so we don't know necessarily whether there is rhododendron there or not. But it would need to be cleared to ensure that the species didn't re-invade the core rainforest area. Further, there's another 80,500 hectares of other habitats in need of similar survey and treatment as required. Now I'm going to move on to the regulatory framework. So as land managers, what are the things that, or as a woodland manager, what are the what does the government tell you to do, essentially, or what do standards, forestry standards, require of you? So UKFS, the United Kingdom Forestry Standard, which governs all forestry operations in the United Kingdom. It's the government's framework, and the requirement there is to consider control. In UKWAS, the United Kingdom Woodland Assurance Standard, which some woodland managers are a member of, but is a voluntary scheme, the requirement is to control where relevant. It should be said that both of these standards are under review at the moment, and it is anticipated that the wording around this will be firmed up as a result of that. And finally, under the Scottish Government 2011 Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, there are control orders and control agreements, both of which can be used to encourage or compel landowners to take action where invasive species present a particular threat. As I say here, these are largely untested. They have on occasion been used, but mostly they don't trouble rhododendron in the rainforest as yet. So Lindsay will talk about the Forestry Grant Scheme and Scottish Forestry's funding, but I'm going to touch on the funding outside the Forestry Grant Scheme, because this has also been an important part of helping landowners to deal with rhododendron. There are issues around funding, whether they're outside the grant scheme. It tends to have been short-term, whilst we're very aware that rhododendron control is a long-term prospect and cannot be achieved within the average grant scheme lifespan. Also, we need to get funding that suits work at all scales. So when you're dealing with rhododendron at a landscape scale, almost always it involves dealing with not only with conventional landowners, but also with suburban gardens, other households in the country, and ensuring that their rhododendron is included within that comprehensive treatment program. Also really important to mention that the life funding stream, which provided many millions of pounds for rhododendron control during the 90s and noughties, has yet to be replaced. So there is a major gap at the moment in our non-forest grant scheme funding. So I'm just going to look at the conclusions of that report and how they might impact on land managers. And here I'd really like you to consider the role of stewardship as a land manager, and the implications of that stewardship. First off, I think it's important the report draws the conclusion that we need a real change in the level of public funding and policy support for rhododendron control in the rainforest. So this is something which will be done, if it happens at all, in partnership, and it requires both land managers, the public and government to come together to make sure that this happens. Another conclusion that is really important, as with all invasive species, to catch it early. The easiest way to remove a rhododendron is when it's a seedling, and you just bend over and grab it out the ground, rather than needing to bring in a squad to get rid of it. So keeping an eye on it and removing it before it gets established is a really important principle. And we suggested that this might be considered as part of the requirements under good agricultural and environment condition, to stop rhododendrons spreading into new woodlands and onto open ground. We also talk about the need to reduce the cost of treatment, and here we're particularly talking about stem injection, which is demonstrably a cheaper method of control, and where appropriate, I think Scotland should be addressing that and using stem injection rather than traditional cut and burn. Of course, this has implications for contractor training and contractor competence. We also highlight the issue of glyphosate and the role that, well, the increasing difficulty that we perceive will face those land managers who want to use glyphosate in the future. So there is increasing political emphasis on the need to remove glyphosate from the land manager toolbox, and that will require a different approach to rhododendron control. We also stress the need for a joined up approach between rhododendron control and the management of herbivores. There is evidence emerging from Forestry and Land Scotland work that where you control rhododendron and you don't reduce herbivore pressures, that you get a poorer outcome. So herbivores tend to eat emerging vegetation and leave a mossy seedbed, which is perfect for more rhododendron seedlings to emerge on. We also suggest that government agencies should look at the powers under the Wayne Act. So that is the power to use species control orders and species control agreements, where the majority of stakeholders are interested in rhododendron control, to try to bring along others who may not see the merit in that act. So one thing that emerged from the same time and subsequent to the publication of that rhododendron report has been a Rainforest Restoration Fund proposal. This is a document that was worked upon by various members of the Rainforest Alliance and was presented to Scottish Government as a funding proposal for rainforest restoration. We see it as part of the ecosystem scale restoration of rainforest. These rainforests, as Arina has said, are our most valuable terrestrial habitat. And really there's a kind of public duty to do something about this, as in Britain we're very keen as the public to ensure that the Amazonians look after their rainforest. We have some ourselves, and it really behoves us to make sure that our house is in order before we tell others what they should do with theirs. We envisage a long-term and substantial funding stream. We looked at the Peatland Action Fund as an example of this. We estimate that it'll take at least a decade, and that the funding requirement to deal with, to restore the rainforest will be in the region of £500 million. We seek to minimise transaction costs. We want a scheme that works well for landowners, that is easy to apply for, so that the money is focused on restoration rather than administrative costs, transaction costs. It's also really important to emphasize the role of restoring communities as well as ecosystems. The rainforest zone is Scotland's least habited part of the world. We have declining populations. We have an age structure which is increasingly not great, and it's no healthier to have no young people in a community than it is to have no young trees in a woodland. We see ways in which rainforest restoration can change that, can bring a new dynamic to the west coast of Scotland. It requires young people to restore rainforests. This is all physical work, whether it's around rhododendron control or herbivore control. It needs young people to carry it out, and we see a really good opportunity to restore both ecosystems and communities on the west coast. So finally, I'll turn briefly to the Glen Creran project. This is an area north of Oban. There are large areas of designated woodlands, of sites of special scientific interest and special areas conservation within the Glen. A lot of it is part of the National Forest Estate, and Forest and Land Scotland had started a programme of control within the woodland. However, all the way up the Glen, there are a line of country houses and with big gardens, and many of those gardens also have rhododendron in them, or had rhododendron. So there was a need to stop the plant from spreading back from these gardens into the designated woodlands. And Bob Black, who was my co-author on the report, and myself filled a project management role for this project. So, turning briefly to people, this project could not have happened without people, and rhododendron control projects I don't think can happen without engaging and involving local communities. Here we see a selection of people at the launch of the event. We were very lucky to have a strong steering group and also to have strong support from within the residents within the Glen. As I say, without that, this project would not have happened. To give you an idea of the scale, The green lines there, that's the National Forest Estate. So that area was being controlled already. The red polygons show where there was rhododendron in the glen. So we had about 34 polygons with 19 owners and occupiers to bring on board. And this was all done voluntarily over a long period of time. And then within the glen, there was also one property with an agricultural holding number. So they potentially could have used the forestry grant scheme, whereas the rest of them we had to find alternative funding for. It took us 6 years to develop the project. We used Scottish Forestry Seed funding to allow the consultants to talk to owners, to survey the scale of the problem, and to ensure that we had community support. The Argyll and the Isles Coast and Countryside Trust, or ACT, took on a lead for the project. So they acted as the centre for this project. It took us 3 attempts before we got the funding package together. So much of that 6 years was actually trying to bring relatively small amount of money, around £100,000 together to ensure that the project could go ahead. So we did have a dance with funders, and this is Bob dancing with a tree, but anyway. A big problem with rhododendron is that we see it's seen by funders perceived as taking something away, whereas funders like things to happen positively. There are also issues around working in private gardens, and also there were issues around short-term funding that I've mentioned already. Our solution was to try to make this project more than just taking away and more than just rhododendron control. We added value through an education program in the local school. We did a lot of outreach, we did training, we did public engagement events, and we also tried to make sure that there was a legacy left in the glen at the end of the project. This brought in funding from Nature Scot, from Scottish Forestry, and from the Heritage Lottery Fund. As I said, we did engage in training local people, trying to make sure that once the main project was finished, and when we moved to the maintenance phase of rhododendron control, that we had people who were living in the glen who had the skills necessary to ensure that the project continues into the long term. And finally, one bush that we discovered towards the end of the project, and it shows how invasive this plant is, I guess. This is way above Glen Creran, and it's only by people on the ground paying attention to these plants and taking the necessary action that we will control rhododendron successfully. So it does require a lot of team effort, and it does require people on the ground to commit to projects over the long term. And I think the quid pro quo from that is that we need to ensure that the public funding that is required to make this happen is there to match the growing commitment to do something about this issue. I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gordon. A lot in that presentation to consider, and it leads on nicely to Charles Stewart Fotheringham, who is landowner at Achnacoan Estate and former chair of Appin Community Council. And Charles is going to talk to us about his personal experiences of the Glen project and their work to eradicate rhododendron. So over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Karen, very much. This, I suppose, follows on neatly from Gordon, who I've worked with for quite a number of years now on the Glen Creran project. And there were various difficult obstacles in that project. Some of the areas that had to be treated, for instance, were in gorges, so rope teams had to be brought in order to do that sort of specialist bit of eradication, and making sure that those are gone back to over the next decade to make sure that there aren't any subsequent infestations is all ongoing as we speak. And I suppose that, as Gordon already mentioned, it did involve a lot of people's gardens and some sort of solution to, if you're taking away a lot of ponticum, what do you put in its place? So replacement plants had to be organised. and that sort of thing. And in terms of the actual projects, the contracts in general were with firms generally from the central belt, and there were certainly delays involved because they had to come up and set aside a week to come and do the project. And of course, this was often irrespective of the weather, and the weather has to be good. So I think, we discussed it an awful lot. It really does mean you need local teams so that when the weather's good, they can go and treat an area, small or large. And it didn't, it was not ideal that the contract had to be made with firms so far afield, because I think it made it more difficult. But at the same time, these firms were capable of doing the work, and the smaller local firms probably less so. And there's still quite a bit of follow-up spraying, but in general, it was a great community sort of project that was very long term and is still ongoing. Gordon, is that sort of, is there anything more I should be mentioning, do you think?
Well, Charles, you might want to talk about the proposals that's developing at the moment to expand out from Glen Quirren.
Yeah. And so out from Glen Quirren, in the wider Appin area, we're trying to develop a new project, again at landscape scale. And we're at the stage of actually finding out what needs to be done. So there's surveys within the next year is what's anticipated to find out how many acres of rhododendron we need to deal with, and trying to, for instance, find funds to train local people to get their spraying certificates. And perhaps set up their own, local spraying firm, basically, that could provide employment for at least a decade. So if we can manage to do that, then it can be we can provide the solutions on our doorstep, and provide a good form of local employment. And so that's hopefully being done through the Development Trust. And so we're just in the throes of trying to start that, so that we will have a solution locally. And it could be that the area is bigger than the Quirren project. I think it's still unknown slightly, but in terms of acreage of rhododendron, it could be that it's bigger. So yes, the emphasis must be on the long term, at least a decade, and the grants and the money don't always follow that. In some ways, the easiest solution would be if there were teams that were available from whichever government organisation is involved, who can just go out and treat areas with permission of landowners, of course. But in some ways, that if there's real seriousness about getting rid of rhododendrons, it should be as easy as possible to do, and the tools in remote areas should be there for people to be able to get the work done. Local communities can, if they've got the will, say yes, please come and do the whole area. And I suppose that would be a way of looking at it. You're looking at it upside down, I suppose, by saying the Scottish Government has the tools and the teams to do the work, and then the community says, please come and do it. And that would be, I don't know if anybody's run the numbers to see if that's going to be cheaper to do over a decade. I don't know, but certainly worth considering. And then I've been asked to speak just about my own personal experience, excuse me, I'll just kill that, of getting rid of rhododendron off the con. Up either side of the drive, there's ornamental plantings of rhododendrons that I suppose total about half an acre. And it was quite clear that this was seeding into an area of natural regeneration about half a mile away. And so I decided, I'd look at the grants, but it seemed to be too small an area for the grant system to really be worthwhile. And so I just mowed them down myself, really, and cut and burn or cut and chip is what I did. And then I didn't have at that stage the ticket to do the follow-up spraying. And of course, they're all now about 5 or 6 feet tall, and I may have to cut them again and wait for the regrowth and then respray. I now have a ticket, so hopefully I have a solution to the rhododendron problem. But it is, doing it oneself is quite a lot of hard work, and really, on any big scale, you do need a specialist team to do that. That sort of work. I think, yes, I think that's about the extent of it. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks very much, Charles. Really great to hear your first-hand experience in all of this, and some of the challenges encountered along the way. I'm now going to hand across to Lindsay Bissett, who is Scottish Forestry Grant Scheme Manager, to talk about the all-important funding available to help deliver some key work. So over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, and morning, everybody. I take it you can hear and see the slides.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm Lindsay Bissett, Forestry Grant Scheme Manager. What that entails is really the delivery and the delivery mechanisms for the grants, and the assurance of that against the various legal bases that we provide funding on behalf of Scottish Government. So a subtle change there, because it's not my responsibility for what we fund. That's more to do with my policy colleagues. But I'm always interested in these views to see what we can do better going forward. So Rhododendron eradication is available for funding under the Forestry Grant Scheme in woodlands. That allows a 20% open ground that's associated with that woodland. And it's fitted into the suite of grants that we call the Woodland Improvement Grants. So they're essentially capital-based funding. So you carry out the works. Once the works are done, we will pay the funding. And the life of the contract would be, monitored. And, we would expect that contract to be, in good condition before it terminates. Within Woodland Improvement Grants, there are a suite of different sub-options, and rhododendron eradication is under the habitats and species. And it must meet the eligibility criteria for that option, as well as the, the eligibility activity for the individual elements. So we will fund to eradicate rhododendron over a range of eradication methods, manual and mechanical. There are different grants based on the site conditions, the slope, and the amount of rhododendron bushes there. And it's based on a standard cost that was derived and independently verified, and that's paid based on each of these. And that doesn't just include the kind of activity. There is an element for surveying and monitoring throughout that period as well, brought into that standard cost. And that's paid as it is for the Woodland Improvement Grants. If the area is within a triple SI or Natura site and it's deemed kind of designated, then we will pay actual costs And that means whatever you're invoiced and whatever costs you incur, we would pay back. Now, obviously, that sounds a lot better than it is, because there are lots of bureaucratic hoops to go through to get actual costs done, as I think Gordon has brought out in his report. Because yes, we do need 3 independent quotes, and yes, we do need to have evidence that the beneficiary incurred the cost, etc., etc. But that's all part of the various, for funding from the public purse. So these are all in place. It sounds far better than it is. I often say to people, be careful what you wish for with regards to that, because yes, it does come with a kind of added, and that will always be the case, whether we're funded by European money or Scottish Government money. With the woodland improvement grants, there is a requirement as part of the eligibility. The woodland that you are eradicating, the rhododendron, is being managed. Therefore, it's under an approved forest plan, which there are other grant funding available for. Or for small areas, just an approved management plan. And that is a plan that shows that the woodlands are being kind of sustainably managed, and that can be fit for purpose for the size of kind of property you have. Alongside those, we would want a rhododendron control plan. And again, there is no set template for that. It's a case of, fit for purpose for your areas. But we want to see that it demonstrates a kind of long-term strategy, that you've got some plan with adjacent neighbours and landowners, and you're taking the kind of control forward, I guess. And also, if it was in the designated sites, and you would have a site management statement. We just want to make sure that that's still up to date and is fit for purpose. Obviously, we can't, and we don't, fund rhododendron clearance anywhere in Scotland. It's based on the current suite of guidance, which is an approach to prioritising control of rhododendron in Scotland. Links are on our grant site, and I can make these, if these slides are going to be shared afterwards, I can add in some hyperlinks to the slides when they're sent round. Now, that areas at the moment are in very similar to the rainforest areas, but not in its entirety. But we will fund out with that, but it's usually to do with a site that's in unfavourable condition, or the removal of rhododendron would bring it into favourable condition. And then finally, just want to touch base that obviously the Forestry Grant Scheme covers a lot of options. And I'm sure we could have webinars all week with different stakeholders wanting funding for their certain elements within that. So there is a balance that we have to strike. We don't have a pot of money that can go on forever. It's all funded now from Scottish Government, although we still can draw down some euros for projects that were approved prior to December 2020. Most of that's tied up in your annual management grants. For the capital interventions in woodlands, that's all currently. So we have to set a kind of barrier to get through the rest. Now, currently for this option, Habitat and Species, we have a funding of £800,000 a year. That's available for the current financial year, 22-23. It's still at green, which means there's lots of money still in there for people to apply for. So we haven't hit the 800,000, and that's, we would expect to see that being hit or getting contracts approved now if people wanted to, do the work before the end of March. So there is money available there. And we have a scoring system within that. And the scores suggest that you need to be in one of those targeted areas, or you need to have a kind of landscape scale project and part of that. And again, that does come with some kind of administrative problems as well, because we need the signing up of neighbours and put in under one application, which means kind of control shifting between the various landowners. So that's the basis of the grants from the forestry grant scheme. I have read the various comments in the report, but I'll leave them there for future questions that I'm sure will come up. But yeah, we do want to be working with everybody to do this and to make the most of the funding that we've got. Whether we can get more than the 800,000 that we've currently got this year, yes, it's about working out where our priorities lie, because we have targeted or got some significant and serious targets for woodland creation. But as you'll have seen in our annual reports, we've never actually fully spent the money. We've committed it, but we've never managed to spend it because we get things such as COVID, such as Brexit, and the reduction in kind of rural kind of employment, people available to do the work. We've also had Storm Arwen that comes left field, and so we have to be a wee bit more creative in that funding. But as we're under Scottish Government, we're doing this on a kind of annual basis. There isn't the same ability to kind of book forward without an element of risk. I think Scottish Forestry are pretty good at managing that risk, so hopefully we can continue to do so. And that's part of but we need the kind of applications and to come in on that basis. So that's me, Karen, I think.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lindsay. Really helpful to hear about the support available to help deliver some of this key work. Last but not least, I'm going to hand across to Gareth Parkinson, a ranger from National Trust Scotland, and Gareth's going to share with us an innovative approach being trialled by NTS at Inverurie, which takes the problem of this invasive species and turns it into a solution which addresses waste management, soil health and climate change. So over to you, Gareth.
Thank you very much. I'll just get this up here. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Just go back to the beginning. There we go. Right. So my name is Gareth Parkinson. I'm the invasive non-native species ranger here at Inverurie Garden and Estate, which is an NTS property in Poolew on the west coast of Scotland, in the rainforest zone. As has been mentioned already, NTS is one of the partners in Alliance for Scotland's Rainforests. I'm going to tell you today about how we're turning the problem of rhododendron into a solution, getting a positive story out of invasive species control, which I think has already been touched on, can be difficult sometimes, particularly when it's coming to selling it to the general public and applying for funding. So yeah, a bit of a background to Inverurie Garden. It was started by this chap in the middle here, Osgood Mackenzie, in the 1860s. When he took on the estate then, I think he said there were only 2 small willow bushes on the entire estate. There were no other trees at all. So the first thing he had to do when establishing the gardens and the grounds was to plant thousands of trees and shrubs, which unfortunately, in common with most big landowners at the time, included planting lots of rhododendron ponticum as a shelter belt to protect the delicate plants in his garden. The garden itself is full of thousands of non-native plant species from all over the world, and it was interesting seeing Irina's slide, the map of the temperate rainforest zones all over the world, because most of the plants that we grow at Inverurie are from those other temperate rainforest areas. So they're all from places with a very similar climate, usually quite similar soils and conditions. So it's not really surprising that some of those species like it here so much that they want to try and escape. But yeah, the most prolific one of all the species we have at Inverurie that's trying to get out into the wider environment is the Rhododendron ponticum. So multiple problems with Rhododendron ponticum, as has already been touched on, but the one that concerns us not the most, but it concerns us quite a lot, is the effect that the rhododendron has on the soil underneath. Where we've been removing large stands of mature rhododendron over the last 20 years here at Inverurie, it leaves a very depleted soil, depleted in terms of nutrients, depleted in terms of the mycorrhizae that will be needed to support a healthy native woodland flora. The beneficial invertebrates, which would be there if it was a healthy woodland soil, aren't there because the rhododendron's been there for over 100 years in a lot of cases. And it's also affected the soil hydrology as well. It tends to be very dry underneath rhododendron. It doesn't, the soil itself, because the rain is intercepted by the rhododendron before it gets there, even in places like this where we get meters of the stuff every year. The control work itself generates a lot of waste wood material, which is great if you're a gardener here and you've got a wood burn and you want to keep warm in the winter, but it doesn't present a big opportunity to generate an income from, especially when we're under a phytophthora control order and we're not permitted to move plant material and things out of the garden because we don't want to spread phytophthora. So we're trying to think of a creative way to use this material that will benefit the garden and hopefully generate some income in some way. So a couple of years ago, the staff here came up with the idea of producing biochar. There was a history here already of producing charcoal, using traditional charcoal kilns for sale in the visitor centre. But biochar was an emerging technology which the gardeners were interested in using. So you might ask yourself, what is biochar? It's essentially small particles of charcoal which have a very large surface area, because you've got all the plant cells within the wood remain and they're all hollow, very, very large surface area. It's reckoned that 5 millilitres of biochar has the same surface area as a football pitch. And what that large surface area does, it has a huge potential to absorb water and minerals and nutrients and hold on to them when they might otherwise be lost out of the soil, especially when you get a lot of rainfall. A lot of nutrients get leached through the soil and lost, so they're not available to the plants. It also creates a really good microhabitat for microinvertebrates and also the fungal hyphae of the mycorrhizae, which are that important link between the roots of the plants and the nutrients and the minerals in the soil. So it provides a really good habitat for that. And on a climate change front, the biochar is very stable in the soil. It could potentially remain in soil where it's applied for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that is carbon which otherwise, if we'd have burnt all that rhododendron on a bonfire, as we used to do 10 years ago, would be lost into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and further contributing to the problem. So locking this carbon up as biochar helps with climate change aspects as well. How do we make it? So we got some funding last year to purchase an Exeter retort, which is essentially a more sophisticated take on a charcoal kiln. All of the charge wood, the rhododendron wood, goes in the centre cylinder, and that's completely isolated from the fire. So there's no risk of that material burning through and ending up as ash, which sometimes happens in traditional charcoal burning. It also reuses the wood gas from the charge wood, is piped out around the inner chamber to back underneath, so that once it's up to temperature, it's actually running off its own gas from the material that you're turning into charcoal and biochar. So it's a very efficient, very easy to use technology. You can train somebody to use this machine in a day, basically, and leave them to use it going forward. Using the biochar at InView, we mainly use it at the moment in our in-house compost system, where it goes in with all the other ingredients from the site that we already use, and then that is applied as a mulch or dug into the beds in the garden, particularly in the walled garden. We've used it in the propagation area, where we're using it to germinate seedlings and for potting on. I've been developing some seed bombs, which we've been doing with schools, a great public engagement activity, using Scots pine seed collected from the site, our in-house compost and the biochar to make these seed bombs, which then the students can come to InView and help launch them into the woodland and the shelter belt, where hopefully it'll give those seedlings a head start and protect them from being nibbled off by rodents and things until they get going. Future uses we're looking into for the biochar is in where we're doing tree planting, adding the biochar to the planting holes to see if that will help establishment and early growth stages. And also in applying it directly to the woodland soil by charging it with minerals and nutrients, and then applying it to try and regenerate that depleted soil where we've had dense stands of rhododendron removed. We've got one objective of my project has been to produce a saleable product from the rhododendron waste, making it into biochar, and we, as of a few weeks ago, we've got this now into bags and into the visitor centre at Inverview. We're just starting to promote this now. We've had the sales have been steady but good so far. It's promoting the project and it generates funds for NTS, so we can improve the sustainability of this work going forward. We could also produce charcoal using the retort, but the way the funding was set up for purchasing the retort and this part of the project, it was exclusively focused on biochar. So everything that we produce at the moment ends up as biochar, but we could retail charcoal in the future as well from the retort. Any waste wood or dry plant material can go through the retort as well. So that's other options going forward. It's a very useful piece of equipment. Another big part of my role, like today, is education and outreach. One of the benefits of being based here is we have thousands of visitors, all of whom are interested in gardens and to a certain extent wildlife and conservation. So engaging with them and educating them about invasive species has been really interesting for me here. It's surprising how many people don't know what species are invasive or not, or what is even a native species or not. It's been interesting getting that across to people. I'm meeting particularly American visitors from the west coast of America who have things like holly, which is invasive for them, and we have the American skunk cabbage, which is invasive for us. So we've done a bit of an exchange there. I extend an open invite to anybody who's interested in this project to get in touch and arrange a visit. I'm happy to arrange group visits for organisations such as Scottish Land and Estates, or anybody else who might be interested. And if you keep your eye on the NTS website and social media, we're currently producing a project film. I've called it Wipeout the movie. It won't be called that, but it's about Project Wipeout, which this is part of. So keep your eye out for that one. Thank you for listening. If anybody's got any questions or wants to get in touch, my details on there. Project Wipeout is funded by People's Postcode Lottery, Nature Scott, and Bailey Gifford. And thank you very much. I'll hand you back.
Great, thanks so much, Gareth. That was fascinating and so innovative. So the sort of solutions that we need in terms of the nature-based crisis. So yeah, and thank you for that offer. I will be taking it up and we'll be arranging a site visit to see you. So
excellent.
Thank you. So it's really over to you guys in the audience now. Now's your opportunity to ask questions, have a bit of a discussion. I see that a bit of chat's been going on already between Will Brett and Alison Connolly. So great to see you guys have been put in touch with one another and taking some bits and pieces forward, which is fantastic. And I see there's a question from Joanna McPherson who is asking, and this is to you, Gareth, is the biochar only made from rhododendron?
At the moment, yes, but we've got a large amount of we had the storm Corrie in, was that early February? I think we lost a lot of mature trees in the garden, so all the small diameter waste wood from the garden is now being stacked and seasoned, ready to be used in the retort. I was actually discussing with the gardeners this morning, talking about the composting, and there's certain things that they can't put in the compost, like phormium leaves and bamboo, because it's difficult to shred up. So now we're starting to collect all of that stuff and dry it, because all that can go in the retort as well. So you can essentially put any dry carbon-based material into the retort and turn it into biochar, because it's just the structure of the material that you need. The actual char is just a substrate for soaking up and holding onto nutrients and water and other beneficial things for the soil. So yeah, you can put anything in it basically.
Joanna, are you wanting to come back in? I see you've popped another question, a follow-up question, I think.
Yes, sorry. I mean, yes, it sounds absolutely mega and amazing, but how much does an Exeter retort cost, Gareth?
That's a good question. I can't remember how much we paid, and it has gone up like everything else. But we've got a trailer-mounted one. The idea of that is we can take it to other places, other NTS properties. I think it's just over £20,000 at the moment.
Right. Okay. So you're a charity. So you're all right. We're not a charity, sadly. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. If you've got any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or if you've got your camera on, wave at me. David Stewart, if you'd like to come in.
Hi there. I've got one or two random questions. As a I'm not very keen on the word stakeholder, but living in Glencreren and having worked for 30 years to eradicate Ponticum inside the woodland garden that we have, we've done pretty well over those years, but it's been a lot of hard work. And of course, it's not complete, but it's very near complete. One quick question is that as a lot of these other rhododendrons grow older, they show off their Ponticum rootstock by you're getting purple flowers on certain branches and certain edges of it. And as that's happening, we are actually taking those rhododendrons out. But I wondered, one of my questions was, how much of a threat is that to any program that's been completed, that older rhododendrons will revert to Ponticum? That's one question. The other question is, although there's been tremendous work done in Glencreren, one only needs to drive the length of the glen, and literally the length of the glen, I mean right to the top of the Forest Road, sometime between the 20th of May and the 20th of June, to just see how much there is left. I know it's a small percentage, but it strikes me that it's incredibly important to go to all this trouble and expense without doing an annual check, because that's the only time that most people, perhaps not people on this call, but most people would recognize Ponticum that had been missed by commercial eradicators. So that's my second question. Maybe I better leave the last question, which is about American skunk cabbage, for another time.
Gordon, do you want to come in? Are you able to take those questions?
Karen, would you like me to have a go at that to start with?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, David. Yep, and even if you don't like being called a stakeholder, I'd also like to thank you for your engagement with the project in Glencreren and for the support that you've given to the eradication program up there. I think they can both of those questions can in a way be tackled in one answer. Insofar as that I think both of them are part of the necessity for longer term funding for rhododendron control. There is this intensive capital phase, which is around the initial works. And after that, I think, and Lindsay touched on this as well, there's a follow-up grant available. The way I've addressed that, or we believe that it should be addressed, is around getting local people engaged with the project. So it's really difficult to see contractors continually going back up the glen, although I would say that in Glencreren there is still one more contractor visit to be made. So hopefully before those seeds are set that you saw in May, they will be dealt with. So we are planning to have contractors back for one more sweep at the top of the glen there and also at the bottom of the glen. So there is some unfinished business there. But both the emergence of seedlings and experience at our Tornish estate, where the Raven family started control in the 1990s, and they are still having to do follow-up removals, indicates that it is a long-term problem. And that's one of the reasons why we need long-term funding to cover that. And I think that part of that will hopefully pick up on where old bushes are reverting to rhododendron ponticum, so where the rootstock is getting away. But also we'll cover, like the slide, for example, that I showed of one individual bush growing away up on the hill. You know, these bushes can be very slow establishing when they're in the heather. It can take 15 years before you notice them because they're not showing above the heather. And unless we have a long-term commitment to retaining a level of vigilance around control, then you're right, the project won't work. So we do need a long-term commitment, and that really has to rest with the residents, I'm afraid. I think some of that might be dealt with, for example, by Woodland Crofts, where you had a person who maybe had a part-time contract for a day a month or something to sweep and to have a commitment to clear 1,000 hectares of ground, to walk over it and make sure that that is kept clear. But equally, I think, to use that word you don't like, stakeholders, there are organisations like, for example, MCS, Mountaineering Council of Scotland, hill walkers, ramblers. There are people who are out in the landscape, as well as professional stalkers and keepers and shepherds, who should be engaged and encouraged to continue that removal program. So I think it does require a broad effort to make sure we keep on top of it.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, yes, it does. I just really wanted to flag up that once the work had been done in Glen Creran, and I'm very impressed with how much has been done and the size of the work. But exactly as Gordon says, is it won't stop for years and years and years. And people like me who've got an eye in for Ponticum over 30 years, of course, spot it faster than just about anybody else. But I'm showing real concern that it's a success. That's my point.
Yeah, thanks, David. I see we've got a question from Robert Clegg. Robert, do you want to ask a question, or do you want me to ask it for you?
No, I'll answer. Let me try and put my video on. Yeah, I've heard a lot about the stem injection, and I haven't probably done as much research reading as I could, but I'm just wondered how you actually go about it. I've been doing a lot of manual clearing of rhododendrons, and I've never actually done any spraying myself. I prefer to go back and pull off the regrowth. And incidentally, someone was talking about regrowth about head high, but actual fact, I've found that yes, you can get regrowth that's maybe 10 foot high and 2 inches diameter, and you can just grab it with both hands and it breaks off. It's very brittle, breaks off and takes part of the root with it, which helps break up the root. But anyway, that's sort of bit by the by, but I'm interested in if anyone could point me in the direction of how do you actually go about doing stem injection, and does anyone provide training?
Ken, Karen, do you want me to try to answer that question?
Yes, please.
So, yeah, there is training available. Essentially, they've changed the qualifications or the training availability for pesticide spraying. And there is now a specialized stem injection module that is available. So, yeah, the college, for example, provides that agricultural college training, and there are various other private individuals who offer training in rhododendron control, including that module, which is specifically around stem injection. It's very useful in terms of certain bushes. So once you've, and I think where you are, Robert, you're talking about already having treated bushes. It works best on big stems, essentially. So once you've already done the main treatment, then stem injection is of less use. And I'm very encouraged to hear that you've managed to find a non-chemical way of dealing with the regrowth. It's exactly that. The rhododendron is actually quite a fragile bush, and it does succumb to hand-to-hand combat if you're prepared to put the effort in. So well done.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Robert. Gordon, we've got a question in the chat, which is asking you, please, can you address the side effects of glyphosate? Doesn't it kill the biodiversity of the ecosystem as well? And they're asking about what alternatives could be used other than the manual removing of the plant.
Yeah, so this is a big subject, and it was one that we did cover to a degree in Glen Creran. It's a very broad subject and very difficult to address in a couple of minutes. But what I would say is that there is increasing evidence that glyphosate does not disperse as quickly as the manufacturers suggest. So there is some evidence, but it is rather limited on the effect upon biodiversity elsewhere. And one might adopt the precautionary principle and not use glyphosate, particularly in semi-natural habitats where you're concerned about biodiversity. However, I think that the thing which is going to have the biggest impact on the use of glyphosate is the impact on human health. So there is in America particularly, there have been lawsuits where the manufacturers of glyphosate have been sued by individuals who've been using glyphosate over a period of time. And that the impact of that, I think, will in the not too distant have an impact on our ability to use glyphosate in this country. It's certainly already having an impact on some countries in Europe where use of the product is being restricted. So we need to think how to, I think in the short term, to minimize the amount of chemical we used. And I see a mention in the chat about eco plugs, which are a really useful way of minimizing human contact with the chemical, and I think are to be encouraged. So I think Joanna McPherson, I think that's a really good thing to be doing. It has, however, raised some issues. There is nothing for free, essentially, and there have been issues raised about the single-use plastics around eco plugs, I'm afraid. So that's good for human health, but maybe a little bit less good for the environment. And eventually we come, I think, probably to that manual removal of rhododendron. It is possible, but it takes a particular dedication. And I think National Trust for Scotland have managed to bring teams along doing that. But basically there are two people, Donald Kennedy and Gordon French, who live in Morven, who have a great deal of skill and expertise in the manual removal of rhododendron. But they have found it difficult to bring other people along, to provide the training required to allow others to take on that technique at scale successfully.
Thanks, Gordon, for that very thorough answer. We have another question from Ingrid from Dunvegan Castle. Ingrid, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. My name's actually Una. I don't know why it says Ingrid there.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much was actually cleared at Glencreran, because I haven't mentioned that yet. And was it all cut and spray or stem injected rather than removed by hand?
Yeah, so that one falls to me as well, I think. And I'm going to be evasive on the answer to the first question because I can't quite remember. There are two ways of measuring rhododendron. One is the gross area. So you measure the number of hectares where there is some rhododendron present. But within that, so you might have a couple of acres where you have 3 or 4 bushes, and then you've got another couple of acres where it's completely covered in rhododendron. And you end up, therefore, with 2 numbers. And I'm afraid I can't remember either of them off the top of my head. It wasn't an enormous area. So as shown from that map, the total area, as far as I recall, that we treated rhododendron on in the private sector, so excluding the Forest and Land Scotland ground, was in the region of 30 hectares. That's the gross area. But within that, the actual area of rhododendron was considerably smaller. And there was another question, Ingrid, which I'm afraid I've forgotten.
It was just about how it was removed. Was it all cut and stem injected, or was some of it pulled out by hand?
Yeah, so we used mostly, but not totally, we used a cut and eco plug technique. So we cut the stems, or the contractors cut the stems, and then they drilled in immediately into the remaining stump and inserted eco plugs into the stumps. So that was the method that was used on most of the ground. Where we were doing rope access, so on the steepest gorges, we didn't remove the rhododendron. We just used eco plugs drilled into the living stem.
Okay, thank you. And I also have a question then for Gareth, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Gareth is probably our nearest neighbour in terms of garden. So I'm on the Isle of Skye.
Mm-hmm.
We have Rhododendron ponticum here in our garden, but it's our shelter belt, and we've been trying to remove it. We're on a 7-year project. We're 2 years in. We're not getting anywhere because we can't just keep up with it. But how are NVU managing the removal of ponticum and not destroying the shelter belt completely?
It's very, very tricky. Yeah. So they've been, as far as I know, they've been removing rhododendron from the shelter belt woodland at Inverview for the last 20 plus years. It's a case of phasing it. There are still stands of mature rhododendron in the shelter belt which can't be removed because we don't have the planting behind it mature enough to take the wind burden once we take that rhododendron out. But a big part of my job since I got here has been surveying the garden and the shelter belt for invasives, mainly rhododendron, but also numerous other species that are trying to escape as well. And putting together a strategy whereby we're removing it across the garden away from the boundary with the estate so that we can create a buffer between the rhododendron that's still got to be retained in the shelter belt for now and the wider estate where we're aiming for complete eradication. And then eventually we'll have the replacement planting ready behind the mature rhododendron in the shelter belt in the garden to take on the wind. But also one of the reasons we've been removing the rhododendron in the first place in the shelter belt and trying to improve the soil is so that we can get natural regeneration of the woodland. So in time, that natural regeneration should take over the function of a windbreak. And it is doing that in some places where we've taken down significant amounts sort of 10, 15 years ago. So, but yeah, it's going to be a long-term thing. And we've used all the different methods, sort of grubbing out by hand. We do a lot of winching with big stumps. That's quite effective. But then also in the garden, we mainly do cut and then stem inject the stumps, just because we can't have the head gardener won't want lots of dead rhododendron in the back of his borders for everybody to see. But then in the shelter belt away from the public areas, we've mainly been doing stem injection and leaving the stems intact. It's a lot more effective than the stump treatment. The glyphosate is moved around a lot more efficiently in the plant, and we get almost no regrowth from stem injected plants as opposed to stump treated plants, where we do quite often get a little bit of regen from those stumps.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. Will, you've got a question. Do you want to come in and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. It's probably a bit of a naive question, as I'm very new to all this, but I suppose it's really just whether there's a whether it's just a question of, well, it makes it sound like it's a small thing, but whether it's a question of remaining focused on the issue and having long-term funding and long-term focus on trying to make this happen, or whether there are also, stakeholders, to use the word, big interests, or that don't actually think it is a problem or need persuading that it is a problem. And I'm personally thinking from the perspective of my own professional background, which is as a campaigner and community builder, and I'm looking to help as much as possible in the area that we've just taken on ownership of the woodland in. And I'm just keen to get advice from the group about how the interests align on the issue, and whether there's a job persuading and bringing along big stakeholders, big landowners, or whether it's kind of commonly understood across everybody that it's a big problem, and it's just a question of trying to maintain focus and funding on it.
Gordon, are you best placed to take this one on again?
I can have a go. It's quite a complex question. I think it does require people to build support for a project, essentially. So a lot of the Glen Creran project, and I've been at this for a very long time. The first time I went to Glen Creran was in the 1990s, and it was a meeting about a different aspect of woodland. And it went very well until the subject of rhododendron was raised, at which point half of the room fell into one camp and the other into the other camp. So at that point, half of the room was in support of rhododendron removal and the other half wasn't. Over time, the half that were against rhododendron removal changed their mind. But that took a generation, I would say. So it depends how patient you are. And it can be made quicker by facilitation, essentially. So talking to people and persuading them of the issues is really important. And I would suggest that the rainforest tag is actually a very powerful one. So once people realize how important the habitat that they have and the habitat that is around them is, then they are more inclined to come along, I would suggest. So there is something, some awareness raising about the importance of the rainforest and the threats that it faces is an important component of getting community support for a rhododendron project. And without that support, rhododendron projects won't work, essentially. So it is one of those things where people have to work across more than one boundary. There are not many estates who are in a position simply to address their own rhododendron problem. They also have to talk to their neighbours, which is no bad thing. But that and then the funding to follow.
Thanks, Gordon. Does that help? Well, yeah.
Very helpful, thank you.
Great, thank you. We've got one more question, which Gordon or Charles, you might be best placed to answer, is what is the percentage success rate at Crieran?
Well, in terms of percentages, there are various ways of slicing and dicing what the percentage success looks like. So I think, first of all, we have to define what success is. We say that, so this is a project that started in, the treatment started in 2017, at the end of 2017, so 5 years ago. And we did get held up by COVID restrictions in the middle of it. So that was a bit of a barrier to trade. When it comes to it, I can address this in two ways. I can say that 99% of the properties we worked with are now in the maintenance phase. Unfortunately, that doesn't include the largest of them. So we still have, and Charles talked about this during his talk, one of the issues we had was with contractors not managing to complete work programs in an effective and tedious way. So we still have one contractor issue outstanding, and that unfortunately is in the largest landholding in the Glen. So we have still got one property that requires further work before we can say that we've got everyone into the maintenance phase. But the maintenance phase is not the end of the story. That's actually the critical bit in terms of ensuring long-term control. And that is that people don't go, wow, that was successful, now we can do something else, because the maintenance phase will go on for another decade at the very least. So I'm afraid that's a rather partial answer, but hopefully will show the complexities of dealing with rhododendron on a landscape scale.
Thanks very much, Gordon, really helpful. I don't see any more questions coming in, and I see that we're fast approaching 11:30 as well. So if there's no more questions, I'd just like to first of all thank our panel of presenters, some fantastic presentations, really thought-provoking. They've obviously stimulated a lot of questions and discussion, which have been great. I hope you've all found it really helpful. Thank you so much for coming along and attending, and most importantly, contributing, because it's the contributing part where I think we get the most out of these things. So thank you all so much. I will, at the end of this, pass on various contact details and get permission to share slides where I can. So an email will follow on either later today or tomorrow. And yeah, have a great day, and thank you for all your contributions. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.